I remember my initial dismissal of it all. Working deep within the Vatican catacombs, amongst the bones of saints and popes, felt like a dream for an archivist specializing in early church esoterica. I saw myself as a modern-day scholar, armed with logic and critical thinking, ready to catalogue and decipher, to strip away the layers of myth and reveal the historical truth. The guards, with their quiet deference and averted gazes when passing certain sections, were merely quaint additions to the ancient tapestry, I thought. Their hushed warnings about unconsecrated ground or forgotten passages were nothing more than the lingering superstitions of a bygone era. I scoffed internally, attributing their unease to their deep-rooted faith, a faith I respected but did not share in its more theatrical aspects. My work, however, often led me off the charted paths. The blueprints, meticulous as they were, always seemed to omit certain anomalies, small structural inconsistencies that piqued my academic curiosity. An unexplained bricked-up archway here, a sudden dead end there. I attributed it to centuries of modifications, of forgotten annexes, or perhaps even deliberate obfuscation during periods of political strife. This part of the catacombs, a section supposedly used for the interment of minor clergy in the late 4th century, was particularly labyrinthine, a dense network of passages that seemed to shift with the quality of light. It was during one such deviation, following a faint, almost imperceptible air current that felt out of place in the stagnant crypt, that I first saw it. Not another bricked-up arch, not a collapsed passage, but a door. A distinct, anachronistic anomaly. It was carved oak, dark with age, but clearly wood, not stone, set into a wall of rough-hewn tufa. The craftsmanship was exquisite, deeply cut patterns of intertwining knots and symbols that whispered of something far older than the supposed 4th century construction. It simply wasn't supposed to be there. I checked my flickering oil lamp against the faded blueprints I carried, tracing the lines of the passage, and there was nothing, an empty space. My initial reaction wasn't fear, but a surge of pure, unadulterated intellectual thrill. This was it, a genuine historical oversight, a hidden chamber awaiting discovery, perhaps a trove of forgotten manuscripts or relics. My heart pounded with a heady rush of academic triumph. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cold, raised edges of the carvings, feeling the strange, almost organic texture beneath the grime of centuries. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light reflecting from the ancient iron above the frame, the initial excitement curdled into something far colder. Etched into a heavy, dark iron plate, bolted directly above the oak door, were 3 words in stark, unambiguous Latin. Non-apere ostium. Do not open the door. The command resonated with an authority that transcended simple maintenance warnings. This wasn't a sign for a storage closet. This was a direct, absolute prohibition. My mind, still striving for logical explanations, rationalized it as a relic from some obscure medieval prohibition, perhaps a quarantine for a plague victim or an interdiction against a heretical sect's buried remnants. But the sheer weight of the iron and the chilling finality of the words themselves gnawed at me. I should have stopped then. I truly should have. The guards' averted gazes, the chilling words, the impossible existence of the door itself, all screamed for me to retreat. But the scholar in me, the part that craves knowledge above all else, was already too far gone. I found myself drawn closer, my lamp casting dancing shadows that seemed to distort the ancient carvings into writhing forms. And that's when I heard it, a soft, wet inhalation. Then an even softer, slower exhalation, a breath. Distinct, deep, and undeniably present on the other side of the oak. It wasn't the creaking of stone or the whisper of underground drafts. It was the sound of something alive, something waiting. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through my academic detachment. My hand, which had been poised to touch the heavy, verdigris-stained iron handle, froze. My entire body felt like a single, taut string. What was breathing behind a door that shouldn't exist, a door explicitly commanded not to be opened. Every instinct screamed to flee, to forget what I had seen, to pretend this entire passage was just another blank space on the Vatican's incomplete maps. But even as the primal terror gripped me, my eyes, drawn by an irresistible force, kept reading. Below the chilling inscription, almost concealed by a thick layer of dust and what felt like dried, flacking substances, was another, smaller plaque. It wasn't iron, but some darker, almost obsidian-like material, polished smooth despite the centuries. And on it, etched in a script I recognized from forbidden texts I'd only ever read about in hushed academic circles, the so-called Infernal Codex, or the Psalter of the Black Sun, were names. Not names of people, but of things. Epithets. And brief, unsettling phrases, almost like instructions. They weren't Latin. They were older, a guttural proto-language that felt wrong to merely perceive, let alone attempt to parse. I thought I was imagining it, the faint thrumming in my skull, the sudden, oppressive weight in the air, until I noticed the guards. They always seemed to turn their backs when passing this specific, unmarked stretch of wall. They never looked. They never even acknowledged its existence, not with a glance, not with a quick sign of the cross. Their deliberate ignorance wasn't out of fear of ecclesiastical punishment, I now understood. It was out of fear of recognition, of acknowledging the threshold, of giving life to the words on the plaque by simply seeing them. And I, fool that I was, had not only seen them but read them. The knowledge I inadvertently absorbed from that dark plaque, the fragment of understanding that seeped into my mind, felt like a burning ember dropped into my core. It wasn't a coherent narrative, but a mosaic of dread. Fleeting images of rituals performed in suffocating darkness, of whispers that promised forbidden power, of entities bound and released by specific appellations. This wasn't merely a door to a crypt. It was a barrier to something that shouldn't be constrained, a boundary that the Church, in its deepest, most terrifying wisdom, had elected to bury and forget. And I, by lingering, by reading, had stirred it. Who would write rules for a door that wasn't supposed to exist? Only those who knew it existed, knew its purpose, and knew the unspeakable horror of what lay beyond its oak and iron. And now, I know too. And now, I can hear it breathing even when I'm miles away, in the quiet solitude of my own apartment. The air shifted the moment the handle gave way, not with a rush, but a sigh. A sigh that carried the weight of centuries, of trapped dust and decay, yes, but also something else. A whisper not of sound, but of knowledge, of memory. It clung to my skin, seeped into my lungs with each breath, colder than the deepest crypt, yet pulsing with a faint, almost organic warmth. The flickering beam of my lantern cut through the absolute dark, revealing not just a void, but a crude, jagged opening in what I'd assumed was solid rock. The very stones hummed, a low thrumming that resonated in my teeth, a sound I mistook for the ancient earth settling, until I pushed through. It wasn't a room, not truly. More an alcove, a niche carved with urgent, desperate hands into the bedrock itself. The space was barely large enough to crouch, and yet nestled within, on a small, crumbling stone pedestal, lay a single object. It was a book, not a tome of polished leather or gilded vellum, but something far more primitive, more visceral. Its binding was a patchwork of dark, uneven skin, the texture disturbingly familiar, like worn human flesh, faintly ridged and mottled. My gorge rose, but it was the inscription that froze me, made the blood ice in my veins. Pressed into the grimy, flacking cover, unmistakable, archaic, yet perfectly rendered. My initials. Mind reeled, trying to force a rational explanation into the impossible. The Vatican priests, the ones who'd sanctioned my exhaustive, meticulous survey of Rome's deepest crypts, had assured me. Nothing remains, Doctor. No uncatalogued secrets beneath these hallowed grounds. All has been purified centuries ago. Their patronizing smiles, their dismissive waves of the hand. They lied. Or perhaps they simply didn't know. This was no forgotten fragment of ancient Rome, no mere heretical text. This was something altogether different. Why would my name, my modern, unremarkable name, be here, etched into a skin-bound relic, buried God knows how many centuries before my birth? The book seemed to pulse, a faint, rhythmic beat against the silence. It drew me forward, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. My fingers, trembling, grazed the rough, cool surface. The initials, my initials, felt impossibly raised, as if they'd been branded there just moments ago. There was a faint scent now, not of dust, but of bitter almonds and stale blood, subtle yet pervasive. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to seal this horror back into the earth, to forget I'd ever seen it. But the scholar in me, the part that hungered for hidden truths, the part that was now inexplicably linked to this abomination, compelled me to open it. The pages were not parchment, but thin, dried sheets of something equally organic, almost translucent in places. The script was an elegant, calligraphic hand, Latin, flowing and beautiful, yet infused with an undercurrent of something deeply unsettling. At first glance, it resembled scripture, a long-lost theological treatise perhaps, filled with allegories and arcane symbols. But then I blinked. The margins, they weren't static. A subtle tremor, a rearrangement of the intricate filigree, the tiny, decorative flourishes. They shifted almost imperceptibly when my eyes darted away and returned, like a colony of insects crawling just beneath the surface. I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the lantern light or the fatigue of hours spent in the crypts. But then it happened again. The words themselves seemed to ripple, the ink momentarily deepening, then fading as if breathing. I should have burned it right there. Right then, in that lightless void, I should have struck a match and watched the infernal thing consume itself. My mind, trained for order and logic, screamed for destruction. But the book held me captive. It was the name, perhaps, the impossible connection. Or maybe it was a curiosity darker than any crypt, a forbidden hunger for knowledge that overruled all sense of self-preservation. It was a compulsion, a gravitational pull towards an understanding I knew, even then, would shatter me. And so, I began to read. The initial passages spoke of creation, not of a divine hand, but of something far more ancient, more primordial. Of shadows that preceded light, of whispers that sculpted reality from the void. It wasn't blasphemy, not exactly. It was simply an alternative. A chillingly plausible origin story that seemed to resonate with a forgotten part of my own psyche. Then it delved into genealogies, names and lines of descent of families tied to these primordial shadows. My eyes scanned the lists, then stopped. A name, my family name. My mother's line, ancient and forgotten, traced back through generations I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just my initials. This book knew my heritage. As I delved deeper, the book began to speak of me. Not just my lineage, but my inclinations, my unspoken fears, the quiet regrets I held closest to my heart. It described moments from my childhood, thoughts I'd never voiced, dreams I'd long since forgotten. It was an invasion, a violation of the most sacred privacy of my mind. It wasn't reading my thoughts in that moment. It was as if it had always known them, as if they were recorded within its pages before I had even lived them. Quod scripsi, scripsi, Pilate had said, "What I have written, I have written." But here, the book seemed to be writing me. The narrative shifted again, moving from personal revelations to the truly terrifying. It outlined obscure rituals, complex incantations, the drawing of sigils. It spoke of sacrifices, not just of animals, but of will, of memory, of self. The purpose: to bridge the gap, to invite communion, to bind one's essence to the primordial echoes described in the opening chapters. It was a codex of forbidden law, a grimoire of the deepest, most dangerous kind, hinting at entities that preyed on the boundaries of reality, that craved recognition, that were awakened by the utterance of their true names. And always, subtly, yet insistently, the book wove my name, my lineage, my very being, into the fabric of these dark rites. I felt a cold dread bloom in my chest, expanding, crushing the air from my lungs. The whispers in the air weren't just memory, they were anticipatory. The book wasn't just describing things, it was outlining my role. I saw my own face reflected in the dark, undulating pages, distorted, aged by an unnatural despair. The Vatican's silence wasn't a lie of ignorance. It was a lie of protection, a desperate attempt to keep this knowledge buried, to keep me from finding it. But it was too late. I had read, I had understood, I had, in some unspoken way, acknowledged the book's claim. The air in the crypt grew impossibly heavy, the darkness around me deepening, pressing in. I felt a cold touch against my neck, a breath I couldn't see. The book knows me better than I know myself, and now it knows what it wants me to become. The light that morning felt wrong, an unwelcome intrusion, as if the very sun struggled to pierce the suffocating veil of ancient masonry and older secrets that clung to the Vatican walls. I remember the pervasive chill that settled into my bones despite the early Roman warmth, a cold that seeped not from the marble, but from the very air, pregnant with something unseen. It wasn't merely the usual quiet hush of history that permeated those hallowed halls. No, it was something far more insidious, a low, guttural thrum that pulsed beneath the surface of the mundane, a sound I initially dismissed as an internal pressure, a residual phantom from the previous night's unsettling discoveries. But it grew, subtly at first, then undeniably, resolving itself into a rhythm, a cadence, a chant. It wasn't loud, not in the way a choir in St. Peter's Basilica is loud. This was a sound that seemed to originate from within the very fabric of the stones, a reverberation that resonated deep inside my chest, bypassing my ears to speak directly to some primitive, terrified part of my being. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and unsettlingly resonant, a drone that spoke of profound age and alien sorrow, or perhaps an alien hunger. I traced it, my steps growing tentative, then compelled, down the grand, echoing corridors, past Renaissance frescoes that seemed to twist in the dim light, past priceless tapestries whose woven figures appeared to shift with unseen breath. The sound intensified near the older sections, the parts of the Vatican that predate even the Borgias, dipping into the subterranean layers where the true foundations lay. I encountered a handful of priests along my path, their faces placid, their movements unhurried, as if the very air wasn't thrumming with an unholy incantation. Each time I stopped them, my voice hushed, almost frantic. "Do you hear that?" I would ask, gesturing vaguely into the oppressive silence that seemed to descend around them, not me. "The chanting, it's everywhere." Their responses were a synchronized ballet of denial. "Chanting, signore." "I hear nothing but the customary quiet of the morning," one elderly Monsignor replied, his eyes, dark and fathomless, resting on me with an unsettling stillness. Another, younger, yet equally composed, simply smiled, a thin, humorless line, and offered, "Perhaps the Roman summer has you overheated, good sir. A moment of repose might be beneficial." Their lips were too practiced, their composure too absolute. It wasn't the calm of genuine ignorance, it was the impenetrable shield of deliberate suppression. Their eyes always were the giveaway, too steady, too knowing, they knew, they heard, and they were choosing not to acknowledge it, a pact of silence more terrifying than any direct threat. I pressed harder, fueled by a nascent dread that clawed at my throat. But it's distinct, a low, resonant sound almost, Latinate, but twisted foreign. It feels as if it's coming from beneath us. The younger priest's smile vanished, replaced by a gaze of cold, ecclesiastical authority. "You speak of things best left unspoken, sir," he intoned, his voice losing its pleasant lilt. "Such imaginings are dangerous, verging on heresy. You are not clergy, yet you pry into matters of faith with an unseemly zeal. Perhaps a formal summons to the Holy Office is in order to discuss the nature of your unique auditory experiences. Excommunication, for even the unbaptized, is a spiritual state, a severing of grace that can touch all who walk among the flock." Excommunication. The word hung in the air, archaic and chilling, a weapon from another age, yet potent in these hallowed halls. I wasn't even a believer in their conventional sense, certainly not clergy. Yet they invoked it. That's when I understood, with a sickening lurch in my gut, that silence wasn't ignorance, it was obedience. A calculated, terrified fealty to a secret so profound, so dangerous, that even acknowledging its presence was a cardinal sin. They'd rather keep their ears shut, their souls sealed, than admit the thing below, the entity I had only glimpsed in fragmented texts, was stirring again. It was speaking, and they didn't want to hear it. Should have turned back then. I should have fled Rome, booked the first flight out, never looked back. The rational part of my mind screamed for escape, for self-preservation. But the other part, the one that had tasted the forbidden knowledge, the one that heard the insistent, resonating drone, was already compromised. It was no longer a matter of academic curiosity. It was personal. The chants, now a constant, low thrum within my very skull, seemed to pulse with a specific intent, a directed force. If they don't hear the voices, I mused, the thought a cold tremor down my spine. Then why do the chants know my name? That night, under a sky choked with Roman light pollution, I found my way to a lesser-known entrance to the catacombs, a place where the tourists rarely ventured, a forgotten access point I'd unearthed in an obscure archival map. The air grew colder, wetter, with each descending step. The scent of ancient earth, of calcium and forgotten bodies, filled my nostrils. The chants, once a distant echo, were now a surging, visceral symphony, a chorus of whispering voices that formed words, distinct and terrifying, coalescing around a single, impossible truth. They knew me. They spoke my name. Not just a generic address, but my full, seldom-used given name, uttered with an unholy intimacy that curdled my blood and seized my breath. It was no longer some nameless entity stirring. It was something that had reached out, touched me, and now refused to let go. The whispers still chase me, even now across continents, across time. I often think about that night, about the decisions I made, and the path I stubbornly, perhaps masochistically, continued to walk. I should have stopped. I should have sealed that crypt door and never looked back. I should have boarded the first flight out of Rome, leaving the ancient stones and their secrets to crumble into dust. The exhaustion after prying open that wretched slab of stone, the visceral terror of the cold, dead air that breathed out from the darkness beyond, it should have been enough. Any sane person would have recognized the warning and retreated, but I kept reading the book. That infernal, leather-bound tome, pulsating with forgotten Latin and unspeakable glyphs, had already begun to sink its tendrils into my mind, its truths more intoxicating than any drug. My academic curiosity, that supposedly noble pursuit of knowledge, was merely a flimsy mask for a deeper, more dangerous compulsion. Sleep did not come easily, but when it finally did, it was not the gentle oblivion I craved. My dreams were not my own. They were an extension of the crypt, a continuation of the horror I thought I had left behind. I was there again, standing before the massive, weathered stone door, its surface still bearing the faint scratches from my desperate attempts to force it open. But this time, there was no struggle, no frantic prying or straining of muscles. The door didn't resist. It simply swung open, slowly, silently, as if it had been waiting for me, as if I had never had to force it at all. The darkness inside was not absolute. It seemed to shimmer with an internal, unholy light, revealing a corridor stretching into infinity. I walked through, drawn forward by an unseen current, my dream self devoid of the fear that gripped my waking hours. This corridor was not merely ancient. It was built from death itself. The walls were lined, no, constructed from human bones, meticulously stacked and mortared together. Skulls with empty eye sockets stared out, ribcages formed arches, and femurs served as support beams. It was an ossuary on an impossible, blasphemous scale. As I moved deeper, a faint, rustling whisper began to fill the air, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. It was the bones. The bones were whispering. At first I couldn't discern the words, but as I pressed on, the murmur grew clearer, forming a dreadful, echoing chorus. They were chanting scripture, ancient liturgical phrases, but they were backwards. Amen became Nema, Kyrie eleison, reversed into an unintelligible, guttural growl. The hallowed words meant to invoke divine presence were twisted into something profane, an invocation of the abyss. It was a cacophony of reversal, a liturgy of corruption, and it seemed to seep into my very bones, resonating with a chill that was far deeper than any cold stone. My mind screamed at the sacrilege, yet my feet kept moving, my dream self a helpless puppet on strings I didn't recognize. Then I noticed it, a presence behind me, a shadow, indistinct and formless, yet undeniably there. It followed my every step, its own footsteps a chilling echo, always one beat late. Thump, thump. A cruel, mocking delay, just enough to signify its separate, predatory existence. I never turned to look directly at it. My dream self understood that to acknowledge it would be to invite its touch, to grant it permission to close the distance. It was the manifestation of everything the book alluded to, a silent sentinel of the forbidden, a patient hunter from the void. The whispers of the bones intensified, reaching a crescendo of reversed prayers, a chorus of damnation celebrating my unwitting journey into their domain. I walked for what felt like an eternity, the endless corridors stretching before me, the shadow always behind, the whispers filling the air with their unholy litany. There was no escape, no waking up from this until the dream decided it was finished with me. It felt like an initiation, a ritual, a profound violation of my soul. I was being shown something, indoctrinated into a truth that clawed at the edges of my sanity. The air grew heavy with an almost palpable dread, a pressure against my chest that made breathing a conscious effort. I was immersed, submerged in the true nature of what lay beneath the Vatican's pious veneer, the ancient, hungry things that slept and sometimes were awakened. Then, with an abrupt, disorienting jolt, I was awake. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence of my small apartment room. The oppressive weight of the dream lingered, clinging to me like a shroud. I blinked, trying to reorient myself, to tell myself it was merely a nightmare, a consequence of exhaustion and too much late-night research into forbidden texts. My eyes darted around the familiar room, searching for anchors to reality. The stacks of academic papers, the overflowing bookshelves, the faint scent of old paper and dust. All normal, all mundane. Until I saw it. Scattered across the pristine white sheets of my bed, just beside my pillow, were tiny flecks of dark, rich soil. Not just dust, but earth, unmistakably organic. It clung to the fabric, a grim, undeniable testament. Dirt, from the crypts. How could a dream leave footprints in the waking world? How could the soil from a nightmare manifest itself in my reality? My rational mind reeled, grasping for explanations. A stray bit of earth from my shoes carried into bed. Impossible. I had been meticulous, paranoid even, about leaving anything from that place outside. A trick of the light, a residue from a previous, forgotten event. No, my hands trembled as I picked up a speck, rubbing it between my thumb and forefinger. It was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of ancient stone and something else, something metallic and rotten. It was the scent of the crypt. The dirt was real, and with it, the terrifying implication that the dream was more than just a dream. It was an intrusion, a passage, a blurring of the lines between sleep and waking, between mind and matter. The crypt had reached out and touched me, dragging a piece of itself back into my ordered, rational world. I should have run. I should have packed a bag and left Rome entirely, abandoned the book, the research, everything. But the dirt, instead of repelling me, drew me closer. It was proof. Proof that the book's dreadful whispers were not mere fantasies, but gateways. And I, fool that I was, kept reading. The forbidden knowledge, the names, the symbols, they had taken root, and now they demanded attention, demanded understanding. I thought I was simply studying history, uncovering secrets. I was wrong. I was being initiated. The shadow in the dream, the one that followed, always one beat late. I feel its chill even now, a whisper on the edges of my hearing, a subtle shift in the air behind me. The heavy oak doors of Cardinal Valerius's private study close behind me with a resonant thud, sealing us in a suffocating silence. The air here is thick with the scent of ancient incense, beeswax, and something else, something metallic and cold, like very old blood. Candles flicker on every surface, their soft light casting long, dancing shadows that seem to stretch and warp the very walls of the room. It's a chamber designed for confession, for penance, for secrets too weighty for the light of day. My hands, clammy and trembling, clutch the leather-bound volume I carry, its weight suddenly feeling less like paper and ink, more like a leaden block of concentrated dread. This is it, the moment of truth, or perhaps the moment of no return. I lift the book, the same one I found in the catacombs beneath Santa Prisca, the one that hums faintly with an unseen vibration. Its binding is dark, almost black, and the pages within whisper of something utterly profane. "Your Eminence," I begin, my voice a dry, reedy rasp that sounds alien even to my own ears. "I believe I have found something of significance." I push it across the polished surface of his desk, the ancient wood groaning softly under its weight. Cardinal Valerius, a man whose face is usually a landscape of deeply etched piety and grave concern, simply watches it slide toward him. He's ancient, a relic himself, his skin like parchment, his eyes deep-set pools of startling intelligence. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't gasp. He doesn't even blink. Instead, a slow, knowing smile spreads across his lips, revealing teeth that are unnaturally, frighteningly white in the dim, shifting candlelight. It's the smile of a predator watching its prey finally walk into the snare, or perhaps the smile of a tired man whose longest-held prediction has at last come to pass. He'd been waiting, not for me perhaps, but for the book, for this moment, for it. He traces a finger along the book's spine, not with curiosity, but with a horrifying familiarity. "Ah, yes, the Codex Obscura," he murmurs, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seems to vibrate the very floorboards. Or as some of the older texts refer to it, the Liber Portarum, the Book of Gates. My blood runs cold. I hadn't known its name until then, not really. I'd only felt its pull, its insidious gravitational force. He knew, he'd known all along. "These seals," I stammer, trying to regain some semblance of control, to assert my meager knowledge. "The ones mentioned in the Apocrypha, the ones that are supposed to protect us." My voice trails off, the question dying in the air, because even as I speak, I see the answer in his eyes. Chuckles, a dry, rustling sound like autumn leaves skittering across cobblestones. "Protect us, Doctor. Oh, my dear boy, how naive you still are." He leans forward, his eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. "They were never meant to protect us. They were meant to delay it, to postpone the inevitable. 7 seals, yes. 7 anchors against the deluge. Rules meticulously crafted to keep the lid on the pot just a little while longer. Every prayer, every rite, every carefully worded blessing. Merely a finger in the dike." He pauses, his gaze locking with mine, and the smile widens, revealing even more of those pristine, unsettlingly perfect teeth. They look less like teeth and more like slivers of polished bone in the flickering light. "Tell me, Doctor," he says, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "have you had occasion to read past page 77 yet?" My breath hitches in my throat. Page 77. I shake my head, a frantic, involuntary gesture. "No, Your Eminence, I was hesitant. There's a feeling to it, an energy. I felt I shouldn't proceed without counsel. It's a lie, of course. I had been hesitant, but the truth was I hadn't yet reached that page. The book itself felt like a living thing, each turn of a page a surrender, a letting go. I was packing myself, trying to absorb the horrors I'd already encountered, but he already knew. He knew what was on page 77. He knew that I hadn't read it yet, and he knew that I would. His smile now is a ghastly triumph. "No, I imagine you haven't, but you will. Oh, you most certainly will." He leans back, a shadow obscuring his face for a moment before the candlelight catches his eyes again. It speaks of the true nature of the veil, doesn't it? Not as a barrier between worlds, but as a permeable membrane, thinned by our transgressions, our disbelief. And it speaks of the nomen obscurum. He says it with such casual ease, that Latin phrase, the dark name, the name that summons, the name I hadn't even seen written yet, a name so potent it was reputed to unravel sanity. How could he know this? How could he quote passages that hadn't appeared until I myself turned the page? It was as if he'd already read my future, as if he existed outside the linear progression of time, or perhaps he had seen this very book, this very content, countless times before. My mind recoils, searching for a rational explanation. A copy, a pre-existing text. No, this book was unique, I could feel it. And his knowing glance, his perfect, unsettling teeth, they belonged to something far older than any man. I should have destroyed the book right then. Smashed it, burned it, buried it in consecrated ground. My every instinct screamed at me to annihilate it, to sever the connection before it became irreversible. But I couldn't. The curiosity, the awful, gnawing hunger for forbidden knowledge, the dreadful, captivating pull of the unknown, it was too strong. It was as if the book itself had already woven its tendrils into my very being, my very will. I kept reading. I had to. And with every subsequent page, the world as I knew it, the reality I clung to, began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. I hear the whispers now, a constant murmur just at the edge of hearing, always just beyond comprehension. It's the language of the book, the echoes of the words I shouldn't have read. They follow me, cling to me, a shroud of sound woven from the threads of my own undoing. The air in the lower catacombs is a constant, cloying presence, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying stone, and something else, a subtle metallic tang that I'd previously dismissed as the mineral content of ancient water. I tell myself, even now, that it was just my imagination, a byproduct of the oppressive silence and the constant, gnawing anxiety that accompanies any true delve into forbidden lore. But hindsight, that cruelest of lenses, sharpens every detail, every tremor of apprehension, into a stark precursor of the horror that would unfold. I was an outsider, a tolerated scholar, allowed access to scrolls and texts deemed too potent for the general academic, but never truly accepted into the inner circle. Their hushed reverence for the cold, unyielding stone of the crypts always struck me as peculiar, a devotion bordering on idolatry, even for men of God. I should have recognized it as a symptom then, a sign of something profoundly, irrevocably wrong. Began subtly, as all truly insidious things do, a faint sheen on the ancient flagstones, a path of moisture tracing an impossible course against the natural slope. I initially thought it condensation, a persistent seep from some hidden subterranean spring, but the liquid gathered, pooling in shallow depressions, reflecting the flickering lantern light with an unnerving, almost oily gleam. And the smell, that metallic tang, grew stronger, clearer. It was coppery, ferric, unmistakable. It was blood. Not a gush, not a torrent, but a deliberate, slow ooze, trickling from fissures I'd never noticed, weeping from the very pores of the basalt itself. My academic training, my rational mind, warred with a primal unease. Blood does not simply appear from stone, but there it was, an impossibly vivid crimson against the dark grey, growing in volume, gathering itself with an unnerving purpose. It moved with a strange, almost viscous current, not flowing randomly but collecting, aligning as if guided by an unseen hand. My breath caught in my throat, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. I watched, transfixed, as the rivulets slowed, hesitated, then began to merge, drawing themselves into distinct shapes, into lines, curves, serifs. Then the word formed. Slow, agonizingly precise, each letter bleeding into existence from the amorphous pool. Benedictus Benedictus. I didn't recognize the name immediately, not as a personal one. My mind searched through liturgical texts, papal histories, obscure hagiographies, but nothing surfaced with the immediate resonance I felt this name demanded. But the priests, the same robed figures who'd granted me access, their faces usually impassive, reacted with an immediate, visceral outpouring of devotion. They dropped to their knees, their murmurs a low, guttural thrum of reverence. Some pressed their foreheads to the blood-stained stone, others kissed the ground where the crimson name lay, as if it were the holiest relic. They didn't seem to notice the stench, the raw, visceral reek of the freshly spilled life, or the abject horror of its source. Quis custodiet ipsos custards? Who indeed? That was the moment, the exact, singular moment I should have fled. My rational mind screamed at me to run, to leave this unholy place, to pretend I had never seen what I had seen. But the scholar in me, the seeker of forbidden truths, was fatally drawn. My curiosity, always my greatest strength and most dangerous flaw, became a lead weight in my gut, rooting me to the spot. I needed to understand. What was this name? Why did it demand such macabre adoration? The sheer audacity of the phenomenon, the impossibility of it, utterly captivated me, drawing me deeper into its terrifying orbit. I could not tear my eyes away from the bleeding word, from the prostrate figures, from the profound, terrifying anomaly before me. And then the blood didn't settle. It didn't dry. It began to shift. Imperceptibly at first, a subtle tremor through the crimson pool, then a slow, deliberate blurring of the letters' edges. Like some horrific, living calligraphy, the distinct strokes of Benedictus began to waver, to stretch, to bend. The capital B softened, elongated. The E's twisted, the T fractured, the sun coiled. A macabre ballet of fluid, guided by an unseen, malevolent choreographic hand. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated terror. A cold sweat plastered my clothes to my skin, despite the chill of the catacombs. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice was trapped, a frozen knot in my throat. The letters reconfigured, flowing and reforming with an agonizing slowness. My mind, still frantically trying to rationalize, tried to make sense of the shifting patterns, to recognize some new ancient scripture, some forgotten saint's name. But as the new shape emerged, familiar contours began to mock my academic suppositions. There was a hard C, then an O, a D, an E, an X. No, it couldn't be. My breath hitched. This was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the horror. I gripped my lantern, its faint light doing little to dispel the growing dread. But it wasn't a trick. It was terrifyingly real. The blood, still seeping, still fresh, finished its malevolent rearrangement. And there, stark and inescapable on the ancient stone, illuminated by my trembling lamp, spelled out for all to see, was my own name, my full name, Codex. Why? Why did the stone bleed for me? The implication was a gut punch, a chilling embrace of the inescapable. I was no longer an observer. I was part of their sacred horror, branded by the very ground itself. The priests, who had moments ago been prostrate before Benedictus, now slowly, silently, began to turn their gazes towards me, their eyes no longer filled with reverence, but with a knowledge, a quiet, chilling expectation that stole the very air from my lungs. The catacombs, which had always felt like a sanctuary of forbidden knowledge, transformed into a living tomb around me. The very stone, bleeding for me, felt suddenly sentient, its cold embrace tightening, its ancient weight pressing down, threatening to crush me. What did it mean to be known by such a force, to have my name etched in the unholy script of bleeding basalt? Was I to be a sacrifice, a participant in some arcane ritual I couldn't possibly comprehend? The conspiracy I had chased, the shadowy machinations of the Vatican's deeper echelons, was no longer something external, something to be investigated. It had enveloped me whole. The air hummed with unspoken knowledge, with malevolent intent, and I, the unwilling recipient, stood naked and exposed before it. I was caught. I cannot unsee it, cannot unlearn it. My name, scrawled in blood on the floor of the world's most ancient crypt, is etched now not just on the stone, but into the very sinews of my being. The world has shifted, its axis tilted into a landscape of constant dread. The priests, the bleeding stone, the name, they are all a testament to my profound, terrifying error. I am marked, I am hunted. And the whispers of the stone, which once seemed distant and irrelevant, now sing a chorus, a morbid lullaby, chanting my name, drawing me ever closer to its dark heart. I walk now in the shadow of my own name, waiting for the stone to claim its due. The air in my study has grown thick, not with dust or the scent of old paper, but with something far more insidious, something that presses against my skin and makes the hairs on my arms prickle. It's a low hum, a vibrational current that seems to emanate from the very pages of the Liber Monstrorum, the Book of Monsters, though monsters feels a woefully inadequate description for the entities it purports to catalogue. Each evening, as the shadows lengthen and the city outside hushes its mundane rhythms, I return to it. I tell myself it's for scholarship, for the pursuit of forbidden knowledge that the Vatican keeps locked away in its deepest, most shadowed vaults. But the truth is far more desperate, far more personal now. I started this journey with the cautious skepticism of an academic, meticulously cataloguing the obscure references, the half-erased sigils, the maddeningly fragmented genealogies of what the text calls the silent choir. They are not human, not precisely, yet the prayers intended to invoke or appease them are terrifyingly familiar, twisted echoes of ancient liturgical forms. The script itself is a complex hybrid, early Coptic, forgotten Phoenician ideograms, and a particularly archaic form of Latin that even my extensive training struggles to fully decipher without the book's own unsettling guidance. But the deeper I delve into the Liber, the less I feel like a guide and more like a vessel. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a phantom of fatigue. I was tracing a particularly intricate passage, a series of invocations meant to pierce the veil between worlds, when I heard it. A low, resonant murmur, a chant so subtle it was almost subliminal. It was Latin, a dark, guttural variant, and it was my voice. Not an echo from the room, not a recording, but an internal resonance that felt like it was plucked directly from my vocal cords only. Before I had even thought to speak, My lips were sealed, my throat silent, yet the sound resonated in my mind, perfectly formed, each syllable articulated with chilling precision. Exaudi nos, qui is in silentio, qui is in tenebris. It was disorienting, a psychic stutter. I blinked, shook my head, convinced I was overtired, perhaps dreaming while awake. I put the book down, walked away, tried to ground myself in the mundane reality of my dusty study. But the moment my fingers brushed against the cover again, the hum returned, stronger now, and with it the echo of my phantom voice, reciting the next line of the prayer. It was as if a part of me, a deeper, hidden part, already knew the text, already understood the cadence and meaning, anticipating my conscious efforts. It wasn't just reading ahead, it was performing the words, preparing the ground for whatever dark ritual this unholy text detailed. My hands began to ache, a strange, throbbing sensation that felt like blood struggling against constrained veins. I looked down at the liber, truly looked at it, and saw that the ink was not static. The intricate, almost biological patterns that formed the letters and illustrations were indeed shifting, imperceptibly at first, like microscopic capillaries expanding and contracting beneath parchment-thin skin. The deep, velvety black of the script seemed to pulse, a slow, deliberate beat that mirrored the increasing throb in my own temples. It felt alive, a living entity pretending to be a book, and it was drawing something from me or implanting something within me. The sensation of the Latin, when I finally did articulate it, was even more horrifying. As my lips formed the ancient words, trying to catch up to the inner voice that had already spoken them, a peculiar taste bloomed in my mouth. Metallic. Not like blood, not exactly, but like iron filings on my tongue, or perhaps the tang of copper from an old coin. It was a taste of something inorganic, something cold and hard that had no business being there, yet it was undeniably present, an acidic bite that settled deep in my throat with each chanted phrase. Per nomina qui nescio, ti invoco, ti adoro. I was invoking something I didn't know, adoring something unseen, and the metallic taste was its signature. I should have stopped. Every instinct, every shred of self-preservation screamed at me to slam the book shut, to burn it, to bury it in consecrated ground. My rational mind, the academic I once was, understood the sheer, undeniable danger of what was happening. But a different force, a profound and terrible curiosity, held me captive. It was an insatiable hunger to know what came next. What terrible truth lay concealed beneath these writhing symbols and pre-spoken prayers? Who were the silent choir? What did they want? And why was my own voice, my very essence, being used as the conduit for their return? I couldn't tear my eyes from the page, couldn't silence the insidious whisper of my own voice, leading me deeper into the abyss. The line between myself and the book has become blurred. I am no longer simply reading, I am being read by it. It knows my voice, knows my thoughts, anticipates my very breath. The distinction between my conscious intent and the ancient compulsion flowing from the liber is dissolving. Sometimes, when the chant of my own phantom voice becomes overwhelmingly loud, I feel another presence, a cold, vast emptiness that echoes the darkness between stars. It is reaching out, through me, through my stolen voice, through these ancient prayers. I am afraid, deeply, terribly afraid, but the fear is now entwined with a morbid fascination, a perverse devotion. I can feel the words forming on my tongue before I even see them on the page. They are not merely sounds. They are incantations, spells, threads in a vast, unseen tapestry being woven with my own essence. The metallic taste is a constant now, coating my throat, a testament to the unholy communion taking place. My lips move, unbidden, following the phantom voice, uttering names that resonate with power and dread, names I know would chill any theologian to their core, names that should never be spoken aloud. The liber continues its silent, pulsing throb in my hands, its purpose nearing its culmination, and I am merely a puppet, my own voice the string it pulls. The true horror is not just the invasion, but the insidious joy I find in the descent, the desperate need to understand the entity that is now sharing my mind, my voice, my very self. And I can't stop, because what if I am the prayer? They caught me, you see, in the suffocating, stale air of that deep chamber where the forbidden texts lay crumbling like cursed leaves under my trembling fingers. I was so close, so agonizingly close to understanding the complete cipher, the ultimate truth hidden in the Vatican's darkest archives. My mind was a whirlwind of arcane symbols, whispered heresies, and the true, unspoken names of things that should have remained forever nameless. And then the hands, cold and swift as a tomb's embrace, were on me. Iron grips, pulling me away from the crumbling parchments, from the tantalizing abyss of forbidden knowledge. I remember the scent of old linen, sweat, and something acrid, fear perhaps. Their fear or mine, I couldn't tell. Their voices were frantic, hushed shouts that bounced off the unyielding stone, deepening the dread. "The door," one hissed, his face a mask of terror, eyes wide and unfocused, as if staring past me into the void I had almost awakened. "The last rule," another choked out, shoving a coarse gag into my mouth before I could speak. I tried to explain, to articulate the revelations that were burning through my very soul, the horrifying implications of the Liber Tenebris and the forgotten lineage it chronicled. But their eyes, those eyes, they burned with a terror so profound it silenced me more effectively than any gag. It wasn't the terror of catching an intruder. It was the terror of a child who has accidentally unsealed a sleeping god. They didn't see me, the academic, the curious fool. They saw the instrument of an ancient, terrible prophecy. They dragged me, unceremoniously, through those winding, suffocating tunnels. Every step upwards was a battle against the crushing weight of their fear and the insidious pull of the abyss I was being torn from. The catacombs seemed to sigh around us, the very stones weeping with the weight of centuries of suppressed truths. I could feel the change in the air, a subtle shift from the oppressive stillness of the depth to the slightly less ancient chill of higher passages. My captors, uniformed figures I recognized as members of the Swiss Guard, but moving with a grim, practiced efficiency that spoke of an older, darker duty, were like men possessed. Their grip never wavered, even as my struggles became more desperate. They were dragging me from the heart of the world's greatest secret, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the secret was now indelibly etched into my being. We ascended, step by agonizing step, past ossuaries where the bones of forgotten saints lay stacked in grotesque repose, past silent crypts where popes slept in shadowed peace. And then, as if on cue, a deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the very bedrock beneath us. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. I could feel the distant, mighty pulse of the Vatican above, and then the bells began to ring. Midnight. The chimes of St. Peter's Basilica, usually a comforting cadence, now hammered against the walls of the earth like a death knell. Each clang was a physical blow, reverberating through my skull, through my very bones. And with each chime, the catacombs shook. Not a gentle tremor, but a violent, lurching convulsion that sent dust and ancient debris raining down upon us. The guards faltered, their iron grips loosening for a terrifying moment. A sound then cut through the clamor of the bells and the groaning earth. It was a sound that shouldn't exist. A deep, wet, grinding groan, as if something impossibly ancient, something made of petrified wood and rusted iron, was stirring from a millennia-long slumber. It wasn't the sound of stone shifting or timber creaking. It was a sound of immense, slow, deliberate effort. My eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint its origin, but the guards had already reacted. Their faces, already pale with terror, contorted in utter despair. They dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but in a prostrate, self-abasing supplication, their heads bowed low, trembling uncontrollably. One of them began to whimper, a guttural, animalistic sound, repeating something in Latin, non est mortel, non est nostrum. It is not mortal, it is not ours. Then I saw it, the source of the groan. Not far from where they had almost dragged me out, a section of the ancient wall, previously indistinguishable from the surrounding rock, began to shift. A seam, impossibly fine, appeared, outlining a colossal door. No hinges, no visible mechanism, just stone moving against stone as if breathing. The groan intensified, a monstrous exhalation, and then, with an unbearable slowness, the door began to open, by itself. There was no wind to push it, no hidden lever. It simply yielded, parting into a darkness that seemed to swallow the already scarce light. The air grew colder, thick with an ancient mineral scent, and something else, something sharp and coppery, like old blood. I should have stayed chained. I should have let their terror become my salvation, allowed their desperate attempts to secure me lead me to some kind of lesser damnation. But the sight of that opening maw, the utter, absolute terror emanating from the prostrate guards, ignited a spark of desperate defiance within me. Or perhaps it was not defiance, but an inescapable compulsion. A single, burning question consumed me. What was inside? With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free. My elbow connected sharply with the jaw of one guard, sending him sprawling. I wrenched free from the other's grasp, the sudden motion tearing at the muscle in my arm, but I barely registered the pain. My gaze was fixed on the yawning darkness, the promise of the ultimate truth beyond. I stumbled forward, drawn by an invisible current, towards the threshold of the impossibly opening door. The guards, still crumpled on the floor, didn't move to stop me. They merely stared, their faces etched with a horror that transcended fear, a profound, soul-shattering despair. And as I reached the precipice, peering into the inky blackness, a presence manifested. It wasn't a creature, not in any form I could comprehend, but a vast, silent intelligence. A cold, ancient light seemed to coalesce within the void, not illuminating, but defining something formless. And then, from the depths of that unimaginable darkness, from the core of that silent, colossal intelligence, a shape began to emerge. A contour, a suggestion of a face, coalescing from the shadows. And it smiled. A vast, impossible, knowing smile that wasn't of flesh or bone, but of pure, ancient intent. A smile that recognized me. If they were protecting the world from what's inside, if this was the ultimate evil, then why did it smile when it saw me? Because it knew my name. I remember the initial thrill, the illicit rush of the Codex Obscurum. Not its true name, of course, but the one I gave it in my mind, a placeholder for the forbidden texts salvaged from the Vatican's deeper archives, the ones not even the Library Damnati dared to categorize. My hands trembled not from fear, but from the intellectual exhilaration of transgression, of peering into secrets the world was never meant to know. I saw the warnings, the admonitions against speaking certain names, performing certain acts, even thinking certain thoughts. I dismissed them, at first, as archaic boilerplate, theological hyperbole designed to keep the uninitiated away from truths too vast for mortal comprehension. I thought they were guardrails for the ignorant, barriers to protect the door, to ensure no one stumbled into the cosmic machinery unwittingly. My arrogance, a potent intoxicant, clouded my judgment. I believed myself immune, an impartial observer, a scholar merely cataloguing the madness of ages. I should have stopped then. I should have closed the book, purged its contents from my mind, and walked away. But I kept reading. The scripts were a chaotic tapestry of Latin, Old Aramaic, and a language I could only describe as an ancient, guttural proto-tongue that pulsed with a raw, primal energy. I spent weeks deciphering, cross-referencing against suppressed Gnostic texts, obscure Hermetic treatises, and whispered lore passed down through generations of Vatican librarians sworn to absolute silence. The deeper I went, the more the text shifted, subtly at first. The general warnings began to acquire a peculiar specificity, not just the uninitiated or mortals, but phrases like the one who bears the sign, or he who reads the words of binding. My heart, a drum against my ribs, began a new, frantic rhythm. I thought it was just the paranoia, the insidious psychological effect of prolonged exposure to such dense, dangerous knowledge. I rationalized it as a trick of the mind, a pattern-seeking delusion. Then I saw it. Not an explicit mention, not yet, but a phoneme, a specific phonetic sequence recurring with an impossible frequency. A sound that, when transliterated, formed the basis of my own name. It was buried, obscured in dense liturgical passages that outlined an arcane eschatology, a cosmology where certain individuals were not merely observers, but linchpins. The text spoke of a warden, a keeper of the threshold, whose very existence was intrinsically tied to the maintenance of a cosmic balance, or perhaps its eventual dissolution. A profound chill, colder than any crypt, settled deep in my bones. My name. Not just a sound, but a sigil, a point of reference in a grand, terrifying design. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to incinerate the book, to forget everything. But the ink, metaphorically at first, was already staining my hands. The book wasn't a warning for humanity. It was a personal instruction manual. The rules weren't general injunctions to protect a generic door from curious fools. They were precise, intricate directives crafted over eons, designed to keep me away from my own designated purpose until the appointed time, or perhaps to guide me towards it. The passages outlining the warden's traits, behaviors, and even specific life events began to mirror my own existence with grotesque accuracy. My solitary nature, my insatiable curiosity, my very academic pursuits, they weren't choices. They were predestined characteristics, meticulously detailed in these ancient, abhorrent pages. I saw references to minor accidents from my childhood, to specific academic papers I'd written, to the exact sequence of events that led me to this very library, to this very book. It was as if my entire life had been observed, catalogued, and then woven into the horrific prophecy, a cosmic script I was unknowingly performing. Quod scriptum est, factum est, I whispered, the Latin tasting like ash in my mouth. What is written is done. The ink wasn't just on my hands, it was in my blood, flowing through my veins. The initial thrill had long since curdled into a suffocating dread. The conspiracy wasn't out there, a shadowy cabal orchestrating global events. The conspiracy was my life, meticulously plotted by entities beyond human comprehension, perhaps beyond even human time. I thought I was free, an agent of my own will. But I was merely a puppet, and the book, this cursed compendium, was pulling the strings, not by explicit command, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of its prophetic truth. There was no refusing the role was me. My name wasn't an accident, a random grouping of sounds. It was a lock, and the book was the key, turning slowly, irrevocably, in the ancient mechanism of my fate. The door mentioned throughout the texts wasn't a physical edifice. It was a metaphysical barrier, a thin membrane between realms, and I, the warden, was somehow intrinsically linked to its integrity. The rules weren't to prevent me from opening it. They were to ensure I understood how it worked, what its existence entailed, and my precise function in relation to it. The horrors it contained, the entities it held at bay, they weren't just descriptions. They were my inheritance, my sacred, terrifying trust. The thought hammered at my sanity. Every misstep, every deviation from the preordained path would have jeopardized not just my life, but the very fabric of reality itself. The book was a warning, yes, but not to stray. It was a warning to stay on course, to fulfill my abominable destiny. I try to wash the ink from my hands, literally and figuratively. I scrub, I scour, I burn the pages, but the stains only deepen, spreading beyond my skin, into my perception, into my very soul. The shadows in my peripheral vision grow sharper, more defined. The whispers are no longer confined to the pages. They seep from the walls, from the quiet corners of my study, from the very air I breathe. They are not merely the echoes of ancient knowledge, but the voices of those who wrote the rules, those who knew my name millennia before I was born. They are waiting. And I am here, standing on the precipice of a revelation I never wanted, bound by an oath I never swore, holding the key to a door I now know I was always meant to guard. But what if the door isn't a singular entity? What if the rules were not just about a single threshold, but about a series of increasingly porous barriers? And what if my role as warden extends beyond merely preventing something from emerging? What if it's about ensuring something enters? The dread is a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making each breath a struggle. The book described the entities, the processes, the unthinkable geometries of the space beyond the threshold. And now I see their reflections in the mundane, in the patterns of frost on my window, in the distorted faces that flicker at the edge of my vision. My sanity, a fragile construct, is crumbling under the weight of this inescapable truth. I am not an academic. I am a cog, a living component in a vast, malevolent mechanism. The final pages of the Codex Obscurum no longer speak in riddles. They speak directly to me, in the proto-tongue, a voice echoing in my mind as clearly as if it were whispered in my ear. They detail the exact method, the precise sequence of operations, the incantations that will either reinforce the membrane or tear it asunder. And my name, my cursed name, is the linchpin of it all, the final component, the last word in the terrifying invocation. I am not just a reader, I am an instrument. I am not just a scholar, I am a prisoner, bound by the ink that flows through my veins, by a history that predates humanity, and by a future already written. The rules were written for me, not the door, and now I understand why. My name is the key, and the key cannot unlock itself. The ink on my hands doesn't wash away, and now I hear the whispers of the things I am meant to keep shut, answering to my name. I remember the chill of the subterranean vault, the stale air thick with generations of unuttered prayers and forgotten sins. It wasn't the cold of the stones that seeped into my bones then, but the insidious premonition of discovery. I tell myself now, in these moments of agonizing clarity, that I should have known. Every instinct, every whisper of the rational mind, screamed for me to stop, to turn back, to abandon the quest for the Codex Mortiferum, the death-bearing codex, that the Vatican had so meticulously guarded, or perhaps so carefully planted for a fool like me to find. But the lure of the unknown, the insatiable academic hunger, the almost perverse thrill of uncovering what humanity had so desperately tried to bury, was a current too strong to fight. I kept reading. I kept opening. The book wasn't leather-bound, not truly. It felt more like a skin, supple and strangely warm beneath my fingertips, its pages not parchment, but something fibrous and unnervingly organic. The script, a complex tangle of Latin and forgotten liturgical glyphs, wasn't just ink on a surface. It was embossed, raised, almost thrumming with a latent energy. Each word I deciphered felt like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed within myself. I thought I was simply translating, interpreting the ancient rites meant to summon, to bind, to unmake. I was so terribly, profoundly wrong. I wasn't just reading the text was reading me. The words, these archaic pronouncements, didn't merely enter my mind. They pressed, they burrowed. They found purchase in the soft tissue of my understanding, then in the more resistant fibers of my identity, and finally, directly into the very core of my being. There was a particular passage, an incantation not meant for vocalization, but for internalization, that spoke of the rending of the veil, of the flesh-made scripture. I recall a sharp, searing pain across my sternum, a sensation like a branding iron being applied to my very soul. I dismissed it as fatigue, as the psychological stress of delving into such forbidden lore. But the pain persisted, a dull ache that seemed to radiate from within my ribcage, intensifying with every syllable I absorbed. I should have stopped when the ink on the page seemed to shimmer, to pulse with a faint, internal light, reflecting not the oil lamp I used, but some nascent glow from within the book itself. I should have stopped when the pain became a constant, gnawing presence, not just in my chest, but everywhere, a sympathetic vibration throughout my entire body. But the compulsion was absolute. It was no longer a choice. It was an imperative, driven by something far older and far more powerful than my own will. I continued to chant, silently, internally, the words burning into my consciousness. Ad aperturam, ad receptaculum, ad mutandum. To open, to receive, to change. The final seal wasn't the antique lock on the vault door or the protective wards scrawled on the forbidden tome. It was me. My chest, I swear, began to distend, to push outwards, the skin stretching taut, an unholy parchment waiting for its message to be etched. There was a sound, faint at first, like distant rustling leaves, then growing, deepening into a wet, tearing groan. My sternum, that solid shield, began to buckle, to fissure, not breaking bone, but parting flesh, slowly, deliberately, like a blossoming wound. It wasn't violence, it was an unveiling. My body was unbinding itself, opening like scripture bound in flesh, precisely as the summary hinted, but infinitely more horrifying in its execution. Above me, I imagine the Vatican has fallen silent. They know, they always knew. I don't think they're praying anymore. Perhaps they never were, at least not for us. Their silence is not ignorance, but the cold, calculated hush of custodians observing a long-foretold event. And from the abyssal cavity where my chest once was, where my heart once beat with such furious curiosity, something crawls. It is formless, yet it takes shape, sinuous and sickeningly familiar. It wears my voice, a perfect mimicry, a chilling echo that utters my name, Codex, 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 but always backward, a corrupted mantra that hollows out my very identity. Zedok, Zedok, Zedok. It's not just a reflection, it's a replacement. I should have stopped when I first touched the handle of the vault, felt the cold dread of ancient knowledge. I should have stopped when the words began to burn, when my rational mind screamed for retreat. But I kept reading, I kept opening. And now, as it pulls itself free, a fully manifest horror wearing my skin, echoing my name backward, I can only watch, paralyzed, as the final, terrible question forms in the ruined landscape of my consciousness. And now, who will close me?